When the Consolidated B-24 Liberator first appeared in the Pacific skies, Japan was caught off guard. Sleek, long-winged, and able to fly farther than any American bomber they had faced before, the Liberator represented a new challenge. Unlike the earlier B-17 or medium bombers, the B-24 carried destruction across oceans. For Japanese observers, it was both a puzzle and a threat, a machine that forced them to rethink their defenses. First sightings. Japan encounters the Liberator. The first encounters with the B-24 Liberator came in the early years of the Pacific War, often in raids against Japanese-held islands and shipping routes. From the start, Japanese pilots noticed its distinctive silhouette. The high-mounted, long Davis wing gave the bomber an almost ungainly appearance, but it also allowed the aircraft to cover astonishing distances. This was unlike anything Japan had prepared for. Until then, most of their experience had been against medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell or the earlier Flying Fortresses, which had limited range and predictable patterns. Reports quickly circulated among Japanese fighter units. The Liberator could fly higher and farther than expected, reaching critical supply lines and bases deep in the Pacific. For commanders, this was troubling. Japan's defensive perimeter relied heavily on distance. The assumption was that the ocean itself was a shield, buying time before enemy bombers could strike. But the B-24 seemed built to erase that comfort. From Rabaul to Truk, its raids forced Japanese planners to scramble their already stretched interceptors. At first, pilots dismissed the Liberator as less durable than the B-17, describing it as weaker in construction. Indeed, some observed that a few hits could set the large fuel tanks ablaze, but its numbers and range compensated for vulnerabilities. Liberators arrived in force, escorted by fighters or supported by relentless waves of US operations. To Japanese eyes, it wasn't indestructible, but it was persistent. It kept coming across distances they once thought impassable. And that persistence carried a deeper message. America's industrial and logistical power could send bombers anywhere, at any time. Comparisons to earlier American bombers. For Japanese commanders, the B-24 demanded constant comparison to aircraft they already knew, especially the B-17 Flying Fortress. The Flying Fortress had earned a reputation for durability, often limping back home despite catastrophic damage. When the B-24 entered the battlefield, it was seen as a different kind of threat. It wasn't necessarily stronger, but it was more versatile. Its longer range meant targets once safe from bombing. Oil refineries, supply depots, and airfields were now in jeopardy. In fighter briefings, pilots were told to treat the B-24 much like the B-17. Attack head-on, exploit weak points, and aim for the engines or fuel tanks. But experience revealed key differences. The B-24's defensive armament was extensive, with multiple 50-caliber guns covering nearly every angle of approach. Nose, tail, and waist gunners worked together, creating dangerous crossfire zones. Japanese pilots soon discovered that the same aggressive frontal tactics that worked against earlier bombers often ended in heavy losses. Another major distinction was production numbers. The Liberator was the most mass-produced bomber of the war, and Japan quickly realized this meant attrition was not in their favor. Even if they shot down a handful, more would come. Unlike the rare and prestigious B-17, the B-24 appeared everywhere, raiding shipping convoys, harassing island bases, and even striking mainland facilities. Its ubiquity made it feel like a constant shadow over Japanese defenses. To civilians and soldiers alike, the B-24 seemed less like a singular weapon and more like a system, an endless tide of bombers wearing down defenses. This contrasted sharply with Japan's own bomber force, which by 1943 was dwindling in both quality and quantity. In this way, the Liberator wasn't just compared to other American bombers, it became the embodiment of America's ability to outproduce, outlast, and outfly Japan at every turn. Japanese air defense doctrine before the B-24. To understand how Japan reacted to the Liberator, one must examine the mindset of its air defense before its arrival. Japanese strategy had been built around speed, agility, and close-range combat. Fighters like the Mitsubishi A-6M0 and Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa embodied this philosophy. Lightweight and maneuverable, they excelled in dogfighting against enemy fighters and in intercepting slower bombers flying at moderate altitudes. Against early raids by B-17 or B-25s, these tactics seemed sufficient. Japan's anti-aircraft artillery was also calibrated to this doctrine. Guns were most effective at lower altitudes, where medium bombers typically flew. Radar coverage was limited, leaving many defenses dependent on visual spotting. Commanders believed bravery, skill, and aggressive tactics would make up for shortcomings in technology, and for a time this approach appeared valid. American raids were sporadic, and Japanese defenders, though strained, managed to blunt their impact. The B-24 exposed the fragility of these assumptions. Its range allowed it to bypass forward defenses and strike deeper targets. Its altitude challenged interceptors, many of which struggled to climb fast enough without overheating engines. Anti-aircraft units found their shells bursting far below the bombers, leaving formations largely unscathed. Worst of all, Japan's declining pool of veteran pilots meant younger, less experienced aviators were thrown into battles against swarms of heavily armed liberators. Doctrine built on maneuver warfare was now irrelevant against an enemy that could fly high, strike hard, and keep coming back. For the first time, Japan's air defense looked not just strained but obsolete. The arrival of the Liberator wasn't just another operational challenge, it was a strategic revelation that their approach to aerial defense had reached its breaking point. Technical shock: what made the Liberator different? As intelligence on the B-24 trickled in, Japanese analysts began piecing together what made the bomber such a challenge. Unlike most aircraft of the time, the Liberator was built around its unique Davis wing, a long, slender airfoil that gave it remarkable lift and efficiency. This meant it could fly longer distances with heavy bomb loads while still maintaining speeds that tested Japanese interceptors. For a nation that had relied on distance as a shield, this feature was devastating. Equally alarming was its bomb capacity. The B-24 could carry up to 8,000 pounds on long missions and even more at shorter ranges. Japanese bombers, in contrast, often struggled to deliver half that payload. The difference underscored America's ability to strike with force and consistency. To defenders watching cities and supply depots burn, it was clear the Liberator represented a new scale of destruction. Then came its defensive armament. 10 to 12.50 caliber Browning machine guns dotted the aircraft, covering nearly every approach angle. Japanese pilots accustomed to lightly armed bombers found themselves flying into deadly crossfire. Frontal assaults met concentrated fire from nose turrets, while tail and waist guns made rear approaches suicidal. Casualties mounted quickly, eroding Japan's dwindling pilot corps. Even the details were unsettling. Reports highlighted that the Liberator's crew compartments allowed better coordination, enabling defensive gunners to switch focus rapidly. Its engines, though prone to vulnerability, were turbo-supercharged, letting the bomber cruise at altitudes most Japanese aircraft could barely sustain. To intelligence officers, it felt as though every design decision had been crafted with Japan's weaknesses in mind. The conclusion became impossible to ignore. The Liberator was not just another American bomber. It was an industrial weapon, designed to overwhelm Japan's air defenses not with invincibility, but with range, firepower, and sheer persistence. Early engagements testing Japan's defenses. The Liberator's baptism over Japanese defenses came not in massive city raids, but in steady, punishing strikes across occupied territories and supply lines. As early as 1942, B-24s flew long-range missions against shipping routes critical to Japan's war effort. Tankers, troop transports, and cargo ships that once moved relatively unchallenged through the Pacific suddenly became prime targets. Japanese sailors and commanders soon grew familiar with the drone of Liberator engines overhead, followed by bombs plunging into the sea. These early missions revealed weaknesses in Japan's layered defenses. Patrol planes often spotted the Liberators too late, and fighters scrambled from distant bases could rarely reach interception altitude in time. Even when Zeros or Hayabusas engaged, the B-24s fought back fiercely. Reports circulated of squadrons losing multiple interceptors for every bomber destroyed, an exchange Japan could not afford. By mid-1943, Liberators began targeting land-based facilities. Bases in the Philippines, Truk and Rabaul were struck repeatedly, leaving Japanese commanders scrambling to patch defenses. Anti-aircraft gunners found their rounds ineffective at the Liberators' cruising heights. Pilots described the frustration of climbing, only to see the bombers cruising serenely far above. Those who pressed attacks were often shredded by the bombers' interlocking fields of fire. The raid patterns were equally unsettling. Unlike smaller nuisance bombers, Liberators arrived in disciplined groups, overlapping their defenses, much like the flying fortresses in Europe. For Japan, this coordination represented another grim truth. American air strategy was methodical, calculated, and relentless. These early engagements confirmed what many feared. The Liberator was not a temporary problem. It was a permanent presence, a machine designed to wear down defenses and bleed resources dry. In testing Japan's defenses, it revealed their fragility, and every raid chipped away at the illusion of security. Tactical adaptations and desperate countermeasures. Faced with mounting losses, Japan scrambled to adapt its tactics. Traditional Zero-style dogfighting was useless against disciplined Liberator formations. Instead, interceptor squadrons were ordered to experiment with head-on attacks, steep diving approaches, and coordinated group charges. Yet the B-24's overlapping turrets punished every tactic tried. Frontal runs ended in streams of 50-caliber fire, while diving attacks left Japanese aircraft vulnerable on the climb back. One of the more desperate adaptations was the revival of ramming tactics. Pilots were instructed, in extreme cases, to deliberately crash into Liberators if no other option remained. Accounts exist of fighters smashing into bomber wings or tails, sacrificing themselves to break up formations. Though such actions occasionally downed a bomber, they exacted horrific costs on Japan's already dwindling pool of trained aviators. Night interceptions offered another glimmer of hope. Modified night fighters, such as the J-1N1 Gecko, were outfitted with upward-firing cannons, attempting to ambush Liberators under cover of darkness. Results were limited. Japan's radar technology lagged far behind Allied systems, meaning most attempts ended in missed contacts or confused engagements. Anti-aircraft units also sought to adapt. Larger caliber guns were introduced, but production bottlenecks and resource shortages meant deployment was inconsistent. Liberator crews quickly adjusted, varying altitudes and shifting raid strategies to render new defenses obsolete. Ultimately, none of these countermeasures solved the problem. Each was reactive, costly, and stretched Japan's failing economy further. For every Liberator destroyed, dozens more rolled off American assembly lines, replacing losses effortlessly. Japan's adaptations resembled a gambler betting on desperation. While the United States treated the air war as a calculated numbers game it could not lose. By 1944, the reality had sunk in. Japan's tactical toolbox was empty. The Liberator wasn't just surviving, it was dictating the terms of the air war. Psychological and strategic impact on Japan. Beyond the material losses, the B-24 carried an even heavier burden: psychological warfare. For Japanese pilots, the Liberator became a symbol of futility. Missions to intercept the bombers often felt suicidal. Engines overheated, fuel ran short, and defensive firepower shredded formations. Survivors returned with tales of hopeless engagements, reinforcing the sense that the enemy had leapt far ahead in capability. Each encounter deepened the belief that valor alone could not bridge the gap. For civilians, the Liberator's long reach shattered illusions of safety. Towns and islands thought far beyond enemy range now faced sudden bombardment. The message was simple and terrifying: no place was safe. The bomber's silhouette became a familiar sight, its drone echoing dread long before bombs began to fall. Unlike sporadic raids of the past, the Liberator signaled a campaign of persistence. It would come today, tomorrow, and the day after. Strategically, the B-24 forced Japan into a defensive crouch. Resources were diverted from offensive operations to shoring up supply lines and bases constantly under siege. Oil convoys became high-risk ventures, hampering fuel supplies already stretched thin. Bases that once anchored Japan's Pacific perimeter fell into a cycle of constant repair, only to be struck again weeks later. In the broader picture, the Liberator was a preview of Japan's impending defeat. It demonstrated the vast reach of American air power, a reach Japan could not counter. Its psychological impact was as corrosive as its bombs, convincing both soldiers and civilians that resistance was only delaying the inevitable. By the time heavier bombers like the B-29 arrived, the groundwork had been laid. The B-24 had already taught Japan a bitter truth: the skies no longer belonged to them. In the end, the B-24 Liberator was far more than just another bomber in America's arsenal. To Japan, it symbolized the crumbling of a defensive strategy built on outdated assumptions. Its range erased the protective shield of distance, its firepower punished every interception attempt, and its persistence made clear that industrial might, not bravery alone, would decide the war. For Japanese commanders, it was a relentless reminder that their perimeter was shrinking. For civilians, it was a haunting presence, a silver-winged shadow that could appear at any time, leaving devastation in its wake. And for history, the Liberator stands as the aircraft that softened Japan's defenses and shattered its confidence long before the superfortress arrived. It was the first whisper of inevitability in Japan's skies, a machine that carried the weight of America's industrial dominance across the Pacific.